having Andrew Ruland in from Integrated Wealth Management is an ideal person to talk about these things. So thanks for joining us in the studio today, Andrew.
My pleasure, Corey.
So, to start with, we're in such a tumultuous world. Everything's turned on end. I was talking earlier about healthcare. Those are challenges from COVID-19, but we've got government spending. We've got currencies going up and down. I guess the key point with investment is stability, and we're not seeing a lot of that right now.
Right. Well, ultimately, we're in probably, for our lifetimes, one of the most chaotic periods of investing. There's always been volatility, but it always seems to be the worst when we're close to retirement or in retirement. And right now, of course, we've got a lot of geopolitical events that are driving the agenda. And that's, of course, in addition to the economic factors that are behind the geopolitical events and things like that.
Yeah, well, and it's almost, it's impossible to predict. I think, we saw warnings and so on, but the situation that unfolded in Russia and Ukraine with what's going on over there. But now that it is happening, trying to forecast and look ahead and how that's going to impact things is kind of where we're sitting. And so a lot of people might not realize it's going to have a very strong impact on the agricultural sector in general, or at least agricultural commodities.
I would think that is actually going to be the single biggest effect of this war in Ukraine, and especially if it leaks a little bit further out from Ukraine, which NATO seems to be poking the bear, so to speak, to try and get to happen. But the secondary and the tertiary effects from the supply disruptions that come out of Ukraine and Russia are really, really significant. And I think, yes, we're going to see the worst of them in the food supply area.
Yeah, and that gets into things that are critical needs, foodstuffs. When inflation starts hitting there, and that's what will happen, then how do we start preparing for that? What do we do ourselves on this part of the world to at least try to shield ourselves from some of those impacts?
Well, on a personal level, we have to think about what does our own food security look like. So there's a big trend towards homesteading for a lot of people, or like I do, grow a lot of vegetables in the backyard. I've done that for years just because I like gardening. But on the financial level, really what we need to focus on is investing in things that are actually going to go up because of the chaos. Now, some people don't like the thought of that because they feel bad that they're profiting off of the...
Feels like you're taking advantage of a bad situation.
Correct. Yeah. But unless you're actually someone who's actually helping to create the situation, you're just responding to what other bad actors are doing. So really, it's just about following trends that are going to work to your advantage. And right now, we're in the beginning of what I think is more or less a stagflation environment, where the economy is not really expanding, but we have so many supply chain disruptions that prices are going up. So the economy is stagnant, but prices are inflating. And that's a very dangerous place to be. Last time we were there was in the 70s.
So would it help with some of the economic development, though? We are kind of well placed as a parallel to Russia and Ukraine. Central Canada is a big agricultural producer, potash as well, which is another commodity.
Yes.
Very big, and it is a Saskatchewan commodity. So we could get some economic growth, at least within Canada, with our resources to counter some of the stagflation, perhaps.
Yes. However, we have some factors that play into it, like there's wage inflation, which is pushing up prices at the grocery store. So if you work in an industry that doesn't benefit from inflation, you're going to be in trouble because your income's not going to go up. But if you work in an industry that does benefit from inflation, you're going to be positively affected by it. It's not just things like potash and wheat, which are essential, but it's also in things like uranium. That's a big one going forward.
Yeah, well, people are starting to move towards zero emission targets and goals and things such as that, and expanding their nuclear generating capacities. And again, Canada's well placed to supply, hopefully, on those sorts of things with northern Saskatchewan and areas and deposits.
Absolutely. The Athabasca Basin is one of the best areas in the world for actually for mining of uranium, and Cameco in particular is, they're a world-class operator. So
yeah, so suddenly looking at another area of hedges and so on, interest rates are low, but then the bond markets are starting to get forgotten, as some people are saying that. How does that tie into things right now? It's a complex area of monetary policy, but when we got a government trying to deal with inflation, then often the banks were talking about issuing bonds to try and that's where I'm hoping for your expertise to expand on it.
Well, actually, the biggest worries that we have, the biggest risks that we have in the financial markets going forward are actually not in the stock markets, because stock markets are really about equity, right? And so they're companies, and they adapt very quickly to the environment that that they're operating in. The biggest problem we actually have is that we've gone through basically a 34 or 35-year decline in interest rates, supported by central banks monetizing debt, or what we call quantitative easing. But we're actually past the bottom of the interest rate market. I'll remember this well because the bond market actually peaked on my 53rd birthday, which was August 4th of 2020. And so when interest rates start to rise, that's when we get big problems in bond markets, because the price of bonds is inverse to the rate of interest that's in prevailing in the markets. And interest rates can go up for a couple of reasons. One is inflation, cost push inflation from a growing economy. But the other reason, which is actually much more worrying, is when we have a declining confidence in government as a borrower. And that is what we are on the precipice of seeing. So people don't think that bonds can really go down in value, and that's always the safest part of their portfolio. But what we've seen recently is that bonds can go down pretty quickly in value. In fact, the first quarter of 2022 was the worst quarter ever in the bond markets. Most people don't realize that, right? And if that's supposed to be the safe part of your portfolio, you need to come in with alternatives to traditional bonds, which is a big part of what we do.
Yeah. So what kind of alternatives are we talking about? I mean, safety and money is always just, I mean, you work so hard for it, you save it. It's a horror story as we're starting to get a little grayer in the muzzle. You start thinking of retirement. You want to make sure that nest egg is going to be there when the time comes. Nobody wants to go back to work at 75.
Exactly. So when it comes to investing in things that are safer, there's dividend paying stocks, and dividends typically go up faster than inflation. So that's a good thing. But on the part that isn't in stocks in your portfolio, you have to have things that are alternatives to government bonds. So we look at corporate bonds, which tend to be shorter term in nature, and there's actual physical security for corporate bonds, unlike government bonds. Because when you buy a U.S. Treasury, you don't get the left arm of the Statue of Liberty. It's just based on the full faith and credit of the borrower. But with corporate bonds, there is actually physical security behind it. The other part of it is to actually look at what we call private alternatives, which would be private lending in the secondary market, or what we call our business-to-business lending primarily, and also in real estate, because real estate is also an inflation hedge.
Okay, and then real estate, yeah, well, that's something that's really been, I would say almost disrupted as well. I mean, we got some markets like Vancouver and Toronto are super heated, and in Calgary, for a while, it was kind of flat. I think it's kind of rising a bit now, but it's unpredictable as many these days, I imagine.
It is, and longer term, real estate, even including principal residence housing, is an inflation hedge. But we also have to recognize that over time, the value of real estate has been driven by declining interest rates. And so as interest rates continue to rise, people will not be able to afford to pay as much for a home because their income hasn't gone up. And the price of real estate is usually based on how much payment people can afford who are still working. So that's going to be a little bit of a counterbalance, right? It's going to be a little bit of a headwind on the real estate market.
Yeah, well, and people with a fixed income, I mean, there's people with a very tight budget, and interest rates, I mean, even a small rise could really put them under a lot of financial strain if they don't have a fixed mortgage or if they're carrying a lot of personal debt.
Absolutely. About 25% of outstanding mortgages in Canada are variable rate, which we think is quite a trap. If people are in a situation where they have, 5, 10, 15 years left on their mortgage and they're on a variable rate, we'd strongly suggest that they look at locking in for the longer term, because interest rates can go up a whole lot faster than people think. Okay. There's something called availability bias. It's one of the cognitive biases in investing. And if we haven't experienced something before, it's not available in our memory. And so the vast majority of people today who are borrowing money for housing or for anything else, they've never had the experience of 10, 12, 14% mortgage rates. So they don't think it can happen. So it's one of those things. I don't think it can happen because this never happened to me before. And that's just ancient history.
Yeah. And it wasn't that long ago, but for a lot of younger homeowners, it certainly, when they wouldn't remember the 80s and the 90s with some crazy double-digit interest rates, and things are secular, it tends to come back to those.
It does, and actually those people of that age would do well to actually talk to their parents about how they dealt with the incredibly high mortgage rates, because their parents would have been in that situation. Well,
in Alberta, I mean, just to tie in a little politics, but there was the National Energy Program. That was coupled with those double-digit interest rates, massive inflation going on, and people literally had to walk away from their homes because they couldn't make the payments. There was nobody wanted to buy the place.
Yep.
The mortgage was too high. I mean, we aren't there yet, but we always got to remember, if it could happen before, it can happen again.
Yeah. Hopefully it's going to be a while before we get there. But the reality is that the longer that governments go on with spending out of control, making drunken sailors look like they could pass a sobriety test. The fact is that governments are spending public finances into a high interest rate trap, because the more that they spend, the less they have from their government revenues to actually go towards interest payments, and then you get trapped into increasing taxes, and yet you have interest payments on your new debt that go up and up and up. So you get into a very, very dangerous corner.
Yes, and then it doesn't look like we're going to be seeing stability anytime soon. Something that was also
Stability? What's that?
Well, I mean, I think there were periods in the past, at least for years at a time, but right now the world's just in a crazy place.
Yeah.
Something I guess that's been interesting is the world hasn't been eager to jump in and get in on a ground war with Ukraine and Russia, which is good. I mean, we didn't have to live through that, but our parents and grandparents, dealt with World War II and massive things that are awful. But we've gone into economic warfare, sanctions, and that's perhaps less immediately dangerous to people and harming people, but it's really, again, causing our world economy a whole lot of fluctuation.
I think that sanctions are actually the equivalent of economic warfare. So it's not a kinetic war, but the reality is that if you look at different places around the world that have incredible dependence on the supply chains coming out of Ukraine and Russia, so this would be, areas like Turkey and Egypt, in particular for wheat and different things like that. But the entire world is really dependent on the use of fertilizers in agriculture production. And you've got, non-hydrous ammonia, and you've got, potassium, you've got all kinds of nitrogen, different things like that are incredibly important inputs to create fertilizer. And without fertilizer, the world's food supply gets unstable and unreliable. And if you consider what happens thereafter, what happens when people get hungry?
Get more war.
We get more war, right? We get angry, right? If a person misses a meal, they might get hangry. But what happens when your food supply is genuinely compromised? And when people think that they have nothing to lose, they lose it. Well,
and again, getting back to people who don't remember, but that was a huge thing in the 80s and 90s. Northern Africa, I mean, they were suffering under a horrific famine. Ethiopia, Somalia, I mean, it was terrible. And that instability through the famine, carried over for decades afterwards. And when we're starting to, impose sanctions or cut off the world's breadbaskets, that's going to have longer-term repercussions.
Yeah, and I mean, there are going to be some winners out of this. Wheat growers in particular, if you can get your hands on it, and if you can manage to carry the cost of higher fertilizer prices. Saskatchewan and Alberta wheat farmers, and to a certain extent in Manitoba as well, are going to do well, and northern BC, of course. They're going to do well because they're going to be able to fetch good prices for it. But the difficulty outside of North America is going to actually be accessing supply. That's the problem, and that's when we get more political unrest.
And then what about energy? I mean, that's something that impacts everything. And we are a conventional energy producer and exporter, though I think we're kind of maxed out right now, but that's what leads to the higher prices. But
maybe we should try and build a pipeline.
That would be a novel concept, wouldn't it? Or even
come on, man.
Yeah, speeding up at least the ones we've got. It's just been agonizingly slow, but we're not seeing many indications on our federal front that they're eager to facilitate this any further than they have, unfortunately, yet.
No, you're right. And I mean, you mentioned right at the beginning of the interview that, Canada's well positioned with agriculture and energy. Well, that's true, but we actually have to be in a position where there is a regulatory environment that actually encourages the harvesting, not just of agriculture, but of energy.
Yeah, and delivering. I mean, it's the whole thing all the way along the line. And some people might want to with supply chains. I mean, nobody ever talked about those more than 5 years ago, and now it's so acute. But we have to remember too, we've been making up for the lack of pipelines through shipping oil through rail, but that's putting pressure on our agricultural producers because they bring in their fertilizers by rail and they export their produce through rail as well, and it's just punishing ourselves all over the map. Yeah, absolutely. It's like shooting ourselves in the foot and saying, "See, take that, Vladimir Putin." Yeah. No, and I guess just morally, if people could keep that in mind when it comes to calling for economic sanctions, is it's not going to hurt Putin, but it's certainly going to hurt a lot of people on the ground. The common people who really wanted no part of this whole mess in the first place. So,
well, it's not the people that ever make war; it's only governments.
yes, and they're unfortunately very good at doing so.
Lots of practice.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I guess just kind of bringing things back to home. You know, how can that's your job and role is helping us navigate those waters, or to try to at least make sure we can weather the latest storm as efficiently and safely as possible. What tools do you guys offer for that sort of thing?
Well, we have a great website with a great video library that we've built up over the last 4 or 5 years. And this Saturday, we're actually doing a live webinar at noon. So Saturday, April 9th at noon. And it's called Grace Under Pressure. And it's actually about how to invest and how our managers invest during the chaotic environment that we're in. And if you can attend live, that's great. But if you can't, but would like to get a recording, you can register for that. So you can do that by by going to our website, which is i-wealth at i-wealth.ca. And you can register for free there and attend that, and gives you a sense of who we are and how we do things.
Great. With the live webinar, I mean, live versus recorded, is there opportunities for questions to be posed then in that case and answered? Or
yes, absolutely. Yeah, generally speaking, the content itself goes somewhere between 50 and 55 minutes, and then we do about 15 minutes of Q&A.
Great. Yeah, just kind of wrap around to that homesteading thing. I'm taking up beekeeping this year, just as a side digression, and I'm doing YouTube University mostly to learn from it. Hey, videos are fantastic online and everything, and a lot of resources, but sometimes wait, I have another question on this, and I don't necessarily have a live person on the other end to ask. I still can root around and find it, and then the recorded product is great. But it'd be nice to catch these instructional beekeepers live, so I can avoid some stings down the road rather than learning the hard way.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, well, I appreciate you coming in. I hope folks get out to that webinar. As I said, I mean, I'm the political weenie. I know all the names and the players and so on, but in finances, I'm a little weak, and that's why I rely on other people to show me and teach me about it. I didn't understand quite how the bonds are working and how that's impacted. Yeah. There's just so much more, but it's important to all of us. So, I mean, if I can't navigate it myself, I want somebody who knows how to do it to help me with it.
Well, that's the beauty of a developed economy, right? We have specialists.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
awesome.
It's been great talking to you. Thank you very much for coming in today. And I'm sure we'll be talking again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Corey. Great.